Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Mining Journal, and with me I have Jonathan Dunn, Anglo American's Head of International Policy and UK Government Relations. Hi Jonathan.
Hi Chris.
You're presumably fresh out of a Tesla or off a sailboat from COP26. How were miners received at the event?
It was a low carbon train I took to get home, to be honest, which was nice to come back from a COP on a train rather than a plane. Look, COP, for those who haven't been there, is a huge thing. I mean, I described it as a series of concentric circles with the kind of intergovernmental negotiations right at the heart of them. So actually, if you wanted to find some discussion about all aspects of climate in Glasgow over the last couple of weeks, you could have found it. The real question I think you're asking is how central perhaps to those negotiations that people would have seen in the media was mining. And to be honest, the answer is not that much, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem in the short term. Not that much because the issues that are being talked about are much more the macro issues. The real issues for miners is how we help deliver those macro issues. And I would say that debate has changed, has moved on a little bit in the last couple of years with publications like the IEA's Critical Minerals Report earlier this year. The World Bank did something through their Climate Smart Mining facility a couple of years ago on the minerals for a low carbon transition. And I think there's a growing realization of the vital importance of the mining value chain for delivering decarbonisation, but it's not central to the negotiations.
Is the attitude towards mining changing fast enough? Obviously, we're very familiar with the lead time to develop a new mine. It doesn't feel like the raw material pipeline will be moving fast enough to meet some of the policy challenges that are imminent.
So one of the things that's really difficult with something like a question like that, particularly thinking about COP, is how vast it is. I, as one person, got a particular focus of a particular sliver of the conference, and it's from my observations, there's very, very little understanding about mining generally amongst most policymakers. Now that will vary, of course, in jurisdictions where mining is a very significant part of the economy. There's a much greater awareness of it, but in places like the UK, for example, I think there's very little recent knowledge and experience of mining from the government side. And as a consequence, there's not necessarily an understanding of all the different steps that you allude to, from exploration, discovery, development, and then production, and how long that all takes, all the different aspects of it, and where this stuff actually comes from. So there's lots more work to be done, I would argue.
I suppose I'm probably more looking specifically at the permitting part of that life cycle that you talk about. Obviously, policymakers have a role to play in allowing the pipeline to move forward. Does there seem to be any realisation, and was there any presentations from anyone, not necessarily miners, on raw material supply as part of the conversation?
So there were. I mean, as I said, the different nature of COP is you've got these concentric circles. So I suspect within the context of the actual negotiations, probably not.
Okay.
But in and around, both within the conference centre itself, where you have these different zones with country pavilions, there was a lot of focus, for example, around the Brazilian pavilion on the importance of sustainable mining, which brought together both government and business and sort of regulatory partners in those conversations, as well as at other country pavilions and elsewhere. But I guess the point is, the real challenge you've got is it doesn't change any of the reasons why permitting is difficult. You know, it doesn't change the requirements for us to make sure we do things in an environmentally sustainable way, in a socially sustainable way, and what have you. So I think there's something needs to happen there where we can come together with government to make sure that we're doing things exactly as we should be doing them, but actually things can be done more quickly.
So who needs to drive that? Does that conversation need to start moving more towards the raw materials at a more general level? As you're saying, it's not quite there yet, and then they'll bring miners in, or should miners be doing more to push that reality and some of those challenges into the policy making conversations?
I think it has to be both. I really do think it has to be both. I think if we as miners need to generate the trust with governments, if we haven't already got it, that we will do things properly and we're not just pushing for our own interests, but there's this wider piece of actually the minerals, the metals are really, really needed for the wider transition, and crucially for those mine affected communities, it's not going to be a negative for them. There's going to be a way of creating sustainable positive impact for those communities that are closest to the operations. Because the risk is, of course, this is seen as a trade-off, that for the greater good, for the electrification of the world, some people have to suffer. That doesn't work. That's where you get the opposition. It's got to be a case of finding a way of generating operations sustainably, both for those people who live alongside and also for the wider benefit.
The mining industry is not very good at communicating that. Do you think we're getting better? Do you think there are other ways? Do we need a champion from a different industry or a different walk of life to start bringing that conversation through?
Look, I can't speak for the whole industry, I don't think, and I think we've all seen examples of really good practice and perhaps examples of less good practice. I'd say it's an anecdote, if I may, one of the observations that really struck me from a roundtable I was at, which was all about the speeding up of delivery of electric vehicles within the UK, which had a cross-sector of people from everything from some of the OEMs to the national grid here in the UK, various other representatives of universities, battery manufacturers, etc. And one of the observations that was made by one of the participants, it was under the Chatham House rule, so I can't say who it was, was just this kind of light bulb moment for her about the fact that she had absolutely no idea of the sort of length of time for copper to go from concept to actually delivery. And that her takeaway from that was, therefore, it was all of their responsibilities in the room to help drive a speedier process to make sure the raw materials were there. And I thought, well, that's perhaps the way forward, that what we've got to do is we've got to get a value chain conversation going here. And one of the things I would just highlight, actually, Chris, is that probably the difference for this COP from previous COPs was there were quite a lot of those sort of value chain announcements. They weren't necessarily specific to mining, but if you look at things like the breakthrough energy concept, which Bill Gates is leading, that's all about technologies and looking at things differently and bringing partners together from across value chains. There was a World Leaders Summit at the beginning, which did a whole thing on breakthrough innovations, which included quite a lot on steel, some stuff on aluminium, various different partnerships which brought together people from along the value chain. So I think there's a growing recognition, but it needs to speed up.
You referenced a poignant moment in the conference for yourself. Was there anything else that came up for you where you thought, this makes me think slightly differently about the way the industry could be responding to the climate challenge?
Yeah, I think the tone of COP26 was very different from the tone of COP25, and it's kind of a more conceptual point, if I may. But I'll give you an example as well, which is COP25 in Madrid felt to me personally, again, personal reflection, that it was all about the negotiation and people were kind of waiting for governments to opine or decide. This COP felt like there was a huge amount of energy, not of the what, but of the how. It had moved from, we're not debating now whether this is important, we're not debating the science, we're talking about how are we going to make practical steps forward in order to tackle reducing carbon, dealing with the adaptation questions, i.e. the impact on communities of changing climates, and also making sure that's fair in a just way. And a good example of that, possibly the most poignant example, was the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. And for those who haven't seen it, that's an agreement between the governments of South Africa, the UK, Germany, France, the EU and the US, I think I've got that right, to support through all sorts of leveraged finance up to about $8.5 billion US, South Africa to transition away from coal. And it's a recognition that South Africa simply can't afford to do it on its own, but the coal dependence of South Africa is also a bad thing for the planet because of the carbon emissions that come from it. That practicality of saying, actually, we don't need to agree 197 countries to do this. We don't need to negotiate with everybody. Actually, this is a problem that we can come together and solve, was really, really interesting. And that sort of can-do attitude was quite prevalent throughout lots of what I saw.
Jonathan Dunn, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.